Hi there, Max Jeganathan here from Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. As many of you would know, we at RZIM are committed to the mission of helping the thinker believe and helping the believer think. And in doing that, one of the great blessings that we get to enjoy participating is standing in partnership with friends and partners of ours, just like International Justice Mission, who do such incredibly important work in fighting and tackling modern slavery, sex trafficking, and the spectre of injustice that manifests in so many unacceptable ways and horrific ways in our 21st century world. And so today I wanted to share with you a message on the importance of justice, and not just that, on the Christian mandate to participate in God's project to fight injustice. In the early Superman movies, not the more recent ones, but the early movies with Christopher Reeve in them, the fourth Superman movie was called A Quest for Peace. And in the final scene of that movie, there's this kind of customary moment where Superman takes Lex Luthor to jail, having defeated him and saved the world. And Superman and Lex are having this conversation, as they often do, and it's almost a little bit jovial and friendly, strangely, even though they are enemies. And Lex says to Superman, well, what happens now? You've done it again. What happens to the world now? And Superman smiles and he says, Lex, the world is as it always was, with good fighting evil. The world is as it always was, with good fighting evil. When we look at our world today, that is the message that we get from so many different sources. And to be honest, that's the world that we see. There's so much oppression, there's so much evil, there's so much injustice, and we've seen it flare up in so many different ways just in these past months alone. But the honest truth, when we look through human history, is that injustice has been a systemic problem for humankind since the very beginning of humanity. This is not a 2020 thing. It's certainly not a post-COVID-19 thing. It's always, wherever there are people, there has been injustice. And so I want to talk about three things that we often forget as Christians and as people in trying to tackle injustice. And perhaps these three things, and thinking about them in a new and a fresh biblical way, might give us pause for thought and a bit more encouragement and success in how we understand and deal with the injustice that is out there. And so I want to talk about the need that we all have for a reason for justice, a standard of justice, and a means to justice. Three things that we don't really think too much about, but three really important things if we're going to deal with that fight between good and evil that's going on out there that Superman was talking about all those decades ago. A reason for justice, a standard of justice, and a means to justice. Now, a reason for justice is something that can easily be overlooked or ignored, but there has to be a good reason why we are fighting for justice in the first place. And a big part of the problem with the world's conception of justice, and accordingly with the world's attempts to fight injustice, is that there's no established objective reason for justice. Everyone is out there in many different ways building their own models of what justice should look like. And when we all build our own moral systems, when we all determine what's right or wrong based simply on our preferences or based on how we feel, then we're going to get conflicting notions of justice. And because of that, we're going to get conflicting notions of what constitutes injustice. And that's exactly what we see in the world today. There was a Netflix show from a year or two ago that rated very, very highly called What If, starring Renee Zellweger, and she played the lead, one of the main characters and protagonists in that movie by the name of Anne Montgomery. And Anne Montgomery was a highly amoral, socially manipulative, kind of multi-millionaire businesswoman. And she kind of typified this idea that everyone should build their own moral system, that everyone kind of is in it for themselves, this post-truth idea that your feelings matter more than any notions of objective truth, certainly objective moral truth. And the telling line of that series was when Anne Montgomery kind of gruffly and angrily said at one point, you know what really annoys me? Having to deal with the moral ideas of lesser people. Having to deal with the moral ideas of lesser people. And in our post-truth world where we are increasingly thinking with our feelings, this is exactly the problem. We think of others as lesser people. It's sometimes referred to as othering by philosophers and political scientists and psychologists. But we create this idea that people who disagree with me or disagree with my moral system or disagree with my conception of justice, they are what is evil. They, by definition of disagreeing with me, are everything that is wrong with the world. And when that happens, our justice comes from the wrong place. It comes from an angry place. It comes from wanting vengeance as opposed to justice, wanting revenge, wanting retribution, wanting compensation. Now, all of those things are not in and of themselves necessarily bad, but if that's where our justice grows from, if that's our reason for justice, then we're going to be in trouble. The reason for justice has to be grounded in a more objective and transcendent place. A more objective and transcendent place. Something that we can all agree on. Now, in the Bible, interestingly, in the book of Amos, it envisions this world that we live in now, this post-truth idea of justice, where everyone is building their own conceptions of justice and then just literally yelling and screaming at those who disagree with them. And it says in Amos chapter 5, "You have turned justice into bitterness, and you have thrown righteousness to the ground." You've turned justice into bitterness. And that's sadly so much of what we see today. When we are trying to fight injustice, when we are trying to stand up for justice, when we're trying to define what freedom and justice even mean, we turn it into bitterness. And our search for it and our pursuit of it comes from a place of bitterness and anger, as opposed to a place of love and seeking the best for those who have been oppressed and suppressed. Now, interestingly, in the Bible, we also get many chapters earlier in that very same Bible, we get a reason for justice that is not seen anywhere else in human history. And we see it right at the beginning of the Judeo-Christian Bible, where God makes people in his own image. This is otherwise known as the Christian doctrine of the Imago Dei, where all people are made as image bearers of God himself. He makes all people in his image. That gives us an objective and a transcendent reason for justice. We don't have to go off on our own and try and invent ideas of justice or ideas of rights or notions of freedom that we then have to come out and defend and fight against other competing notions about. It's an objective transcendent source that gives us a reason for justice, the Imago Dei, that we are made, each of us, in the image of God. And whenever that image is violated, through sexual slavery, through human trafficking, through the online exploitation of children, whenever that image of God is violated in any person, we have injustice. Injustice that is unacceptable. A violation of freedom that is unacceptable. A violation of the sanctity of the individual that God has ordained that is unacceptable, that we are called to rise up and fight. But it's very difficult to even agree on what that injustice constitutes, let alone what justice we are aiming for, unless we first accept that we are all made in the image of God. There is something that is equally and transcendentally true about each of us that gives us that sense of dignity and value and worth, and according to the Christian message, infinite worth, from a God who made us out of love in his own image. And so that Imago Dei gives us a reason for justice. But that's not enough. We also need a standard of justice. And equally, as we all argue over the reasons for justice, we also argue, if we throw God out of the picture, we argue over what the standard for justice actually is. And throughout human history, if you look just at political philosophy alone, we see all of these other reasons, many of them well-intentioned reasons, on which people have tried to build just societies, whether it's based on utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, based on optimizing freedom, the freedom from government constraints or other kinds of constraints, whether it's based on equality of opportunity or equality of outcomes. All of these different isms, whether it's socialism or communism or capitalism or utilitarianism or liberalism, whatever it might be, they're all trying to put in place a standard of justice. What does justice actually look like? Now, in the range of governmental necessities, we need governments, right? We need governments and structures through which to govern our communities. But that's not what I'm talking about here. When we look inside the Bible once again gives us a standard of justice that is above and beyond any governmental standard of justice. And it's these words, these timeless words that were uttered by Jesus Christ himself, where he says, "Go and love your neighbor as you love yourself." Now, that golden rule, which is often talked about, is not actually a rule. It's a relational mandate that followers of Jesus are given, that all people are given through Jesus. He says, go and love people with a supernatural, transcendent love. Now that standard is a countercultural, non-human standard. A big part of the problem, I think, with how we deal with issues of justice and freedom today is that we think that love is the lack of love is a problem, and so we have to solve it quantitatively. And so people say we just need more love. And maybe that's why we find, because it just pours out of human hearts, this realization, we find love being talked about and written about and sung about and acted about in so many examples of creative expression, whether it's in our movies or our literature or our songs. Everyone's writing about love. You know, the Black Eyed Peas, Where is the Love? The Beatles, All You Need Is Love. Pretty much every movie, every song, every poem has got love in there somewhere. There's pretty much universal acknowledgement that love is the supreme ethic. Love is what we need to underpin our justice with. But we think it's a quantitative problem. We think we just need more love. What if the problem is qualitative? Jesus says the kind of love we're looking for is love that pours out not just on people who are oppressed and disadvantaged that we like and want to help, but even on our enemies. This God who came into the world as a person, Jesus Christ, who literally loved the people who were killing him while they were killing him. That is the standard of love that pours into the standard of justice that we are called to. That standard of supernatural love. So, in making us all in his image, God gives us a reason for justice, that we're all image bearers, the Imago Dei. And in sending his son, Jesus Christ, to just live alone, live that morally exemplary life of defining and also living out that supernatural countercultural love, he gives us also a standard for justice. The problem with this standard for justice that Jesus gives us, he lives it out himself, he talks about it again and again, he tells us elsewhere through the writer, the great Christian theologian, evangelist and writer, Paul, the apostle. He gives us these fruits of the Spirit, these fruits of that love and justice and freedom, what it should look like in how we live. Love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness and self-control. So he declares it, he exemplifies it, then we're given even more details about it. The problem with this standard of justice that we are called to is that it's impossible to live out in our own strength. That's the problem. So we don't just need a reason for justice, which God gives us through the Imago Dei. We don't just need a standard of justice, which Jesus gives us through his life and through the golden mandate, the golden standard of supernatural love. We also do need a means to justice. We need a means to justice. We need a way to get there, a way through which to fight for freedom. Fuel, if you like. If justice is the car, if freedom is the car that we are looking for, then we need something to fuel it. We need some kind of petrol source. And this is where the Christian message really comes to life. Because not only does the Christian message offer us a reason for justice and a standard of justice, it offers us a means to justice through relationship with God himself. Now here's where that line out of Amos is really important. Amos, that book, that prophet is basically saying, if you try and do this in your own strength, if you're all about self-sufficiency and trying to define freedom and justice for yourself and then pursue it, you will turn it into bitterness and you will throw righteousness to the ground. Now, we see all kinds of examples out there of the perhaps even honest and well-intentioned pursuit of justice is being turned into bitterness because it's coming from an angry place, right? Rather than an honourable and a just and a loving place. But the kicker is in the second line. You turn justice into bitterness and you throw righteousness to the ground. Righteousness effectively means, and it's a complicated kind of theologically, potentially technical term, but all it really means is being right with God, right? It's that kind of righteousness or perfection that only comes from being in right relationship with God. So there's no one righteous. In the Bible it tells us again and again, there's no one righteous. We get that through our relationship with God. And so what Amos is telling us is that the reason, one of the main reasons, the source reason why your justice has been turned to bitterness and your calls for justice have not been loving but they've been angry and they've not been seeking truth and welfare of others, they've been seeking vengeance and retribution, it's because you've thrown righteousness to the ground. That's the problem. You threw righteousness to the ground. You ignored your relationship with God. You ignored your need for rescue. You ignored your need for restoration. You ignored your need for your own redemption. And that's why your calls for justice have been turned into bitterness, because you threw righteousness to the ground. And so this means to justice that God offers us has to begin with the rescue of ourselves. It has to begin with the transformation of ourselves so we can then go and transform our world. So we can then go and fight for freedom. So we can then go and tackle injustice. And that's exactly what Jesus offers us by going to the cross, taking all of the brokenness, all of the injustice, all of the violations of dignity, the violations of freedom that humankind has perpetrated and continues to perpetrate against one another, and all of the other internal and existential brokenness that we all face, right? Guilt and shame and anxiety and struggles and brokenness within ourselves. He takes it all onto himself on that cross. In dying, he does away with it. He pays the price for it. He acquits, cosmologically, acquits us of it, and now opens up a possible life for us through relationship with him, where we have strength and comfort through the suffering and the struggles that we are all dealing with, but we are also liberated and empowered and endowed with that supernatural love I was talking about, through which we can go out there and fight injustice, through which we can go out there and identify where the image of God has been violated, where people have been suppressed and oppressed. And we can go about that using not man-made love, not love that we generate, but a supernatural, countercultural love. There's this funny moment in the first Thor movie of the Avengers movie franchise, where this is the first glimpse that planet Earth is getting of Thor, in this series anyway. And Thor is fighting a bunch of bad guys who are intergalactic bad guys, so they've all come from other planets, and he's fighting them on Earth. But the earthly authorities are kind of confused about who's on whose side, who's Thor, what's happening. And Thor, of course, is using his hammer, which he uses to channel all of his power, the lightning bolts and all of that stuff. And one of the earthly authorities, I think it's like an FBI agent or something, he's in a tank and he gets out his megaphone and he says, "It looks like you're using unregistered weapons technology. It seems you're using unregistered weapons technology. Please desist." He's trying to work out who Thor is, and clearly this supernatural, superhuman hammer that brings down lightning is just completely foreign, right, to these guys. So it completely, blows their system of categorizing weaponry out of the water. When we are walking with Jesus, when we acknowledge that Jesus is not just our standard of justice, he's also our means to justice and fighting for it, we get access to supernatural love technology, unregistered love technology. That's the love technology that the world needs out there as we go out there and fight the scourge and the spectre of modern day slavery, of sex trafficking, of all these horrific and unacceptable manifestations of injustice, where the dignity of individuals has been violated because the image of God has been violated. And that standard of loving our neighbour as ourselves compels us as followers of Jesus to go out there and do what we can with what we've got, to tackle it, and to fight it, and to bring about and participate in God's project of restoration and redemption. Now, that project ultimately will only be finalized in and through and by God himself. But we are called today to participate in that. First, though, we need to go to God. We need to acknowledge that the reason that sometimes our calls for justice are bitter is because we have thrown righteousness to the ground. And just 19 verses later in that very same chapter, we see it again, where Amos writes those famous words that Dr. King declared at the Washington Memorial all those years ago. He said, "Let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a mighty waterfall." Let justice flow down like a river and righteousness like a mighty waterfall. Justice and righteousness have to go together. Being right with God, taking care of that relationship with God first, has to come first. That enables us then to take care of those other relationships with one another. We were made for two reasons: to be in loving relationship with God and loving relationship with other people. And fighting injustice flows directly from the second of those two. But in order to live that out, we need a reason, we need a standard, and we need a means. And that all comes through a relationship with Jesus Christ, an up-close and personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It's funny, that line by Superman, "The world is as it always was, with good fighting evil," that is the case today. The best statistics we have now that International Justice Mission provides us with suggest that there are something like 40 million modern-day slaves. Something even more horrific than that, if possible, is that 1 in 4 of those are children. There's an incredible statistic that comes out of the part of the world where I'm from. I was born in Sri Lanka in the subcontinent. A statistic from 2016 suggests that in India alone, a child went missing every 12 minutes. A child went missing every 12 minutes, the vast majority of which are never found again because they're taken, they are exploited, they are trafficked. These horrific manifestations of injustice today are unacceptable. Now, you don't need to be a Christian, I get that, to know that they are unacceptable. But through the message of Jesus Christ and through the love and the power of Jesus Christ, we have a reason for justice, a standard of justice and a means to justice. And through all of those things, we can be empowered to fight injustice in all of its forms. And International Justice Mission is a fantastic example of that. They are doing it in a systematic, a structured, in a highly professional way, but they are driven by the Holy Spirit. They are driven by those three things because they know that these violations of the image of God are unacceptable. They know that this standard that Jesus gave us to love our neighbours as ourselves compels them to go out there and love these people and help to liberate them, to give them the freedom that God always intended for them. So this is God's project of restoration and fighting injustice that IJM are a part of. And so what we want to do today is to really encourage you to step into that. If you feel led to step into that, to think about and pray about what you can do to be a part of fighting for the freedom of people whom society has left behind. We built all of these isms of governmental and economic structures, but no matter what we do, it always seems to leave people behind. It always seems to oppress and subject people. It subjectifies them in their dignity, and then it violates even that subjective standard of dignity that it creates. The world is as it always was, as Superman said, with good fighting evil. But the first thing we need to remember is that that fight between good and evil is not about the evil out there and the good in here. It goes on in every human heart. The fight between good and evil is in every human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his famous line, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, he wrote, and I'm paraphrasing him, he wrote that the line that divides good and evil cuts through the heart of every man and woman. The line that divides good and evil cuts through the heart of every man and woman. So we need to start by going to God, by addressing our need for a righteousness that comes from somewhere else. But then, once we are in that right relationship with God, we are then compelled to allow that love of God to flow out onto those around us. And one way in which that happens, and one way in which we are called upon to do what we can, is in fighting systemic manifestations of evil and systemic manifestations of injustice. And modern slavery is one of the most horrific and unacceptable examples of that. And so you're going to get some information from your church on how you might be able and willing to step into that project that God is running to alleviate injustice, to tackle it, to fight it, to be part of this freedom project of God himself, having provided us with a reason for justice, a standard of justice, and a means to justice in and through the person of Jesus Christ. I encourage you and implore you to invest in that relationship with Jesus first, to draw closer to him, and then through the love that will be poured into your life and into your heart, to then pour that out on others whom society, our broken society amidst all of our brokenness, has left behind. You're going to get some more information. I encourage you to find out more and to step up and step in and participate in this project alongside great organizations and institutions like International Justice Mission and the incredible work that they do. The world is as it always was, with good fighting evil. Let's first deal with the evil in here through a relationship with Jesus Christ, and then let's get out there and fight the evil that is out there by tackling injustice in and through and by the person of Jesus and the supernatural love that we enjoy and that we can then exude because of him. Thanks so much for giving me a hearing. God bless you this Freedom Sunday, and take care.